60 Great Ghost Stories, read by H. Washington Sawyer. Tonight's story, When the Clock Strikes, by Tanith Lee. Yes, the great ballroom is filled only with dust now. The slender columns of the white marble and the slender columns of rose-red marble are woven together by cobwebs. The vivid frescoes on which the Duke's treasury spent so much are dimmed by dust. The faces of the painted goddesses look gray, and the velvet curtains, touch them, they will crumble. 200 years now since anyone danced in this place on the sea-green floor in the candle gleam. 200 years since the wonderful clock struck for the very last time. I thought you might care to examine the clock. It was considered exceptional in its day. The pedestal is ebony and the face fine porcelain, and these figures, which are of silver, would pass slowly about the circlet of the face. Each figure represents, you understand, an hour. And as the appropriate hours came level with this golden bell, they would strike it the correct number of times. All the figures are unique, as you see. Beginning at the first hour, they are, in this order, a girl child, a dwarf, a maiden, a youth, a lady and a knight, and here, notice, the figures grow older as the day declines, a queen and king for the 7th and 8th hours, and after these an abbess and a magician, next to the last a hag. But the very last is the strangest of all. The 12th figure, do you recognize him? It is Death. Yes, a most curious clock. It is reckoned a marvelous thing, then, but it has not struck for 200 years. Possibly you have been told the story. No? Oh, but I am certain that you have heard it. In another form, perhaps. However, as you have some while to wait for your carriage, I will recount the tale, if you wish. I will start with what was said of the clock. In those years, the city was prosperous, a stronghold, not as you see it today. Much was made in the city that was ornamental and unusual, but the clock, on which the 12th hour was death, caused something of a stir. It was thought unlucky, foolhardy, to have such a clock. It began to be murmured, jokingly by some, by others in earnest, that one night when the clock struck the 12th hour, death would truly strike with it. Now life has always been a chancy business, and it was more so then. The great plague had come but 20 years before, and was not yet forgotten. Besides, in the Duke's court there was much intrigue, while the enemies might be supposed to plot beyond the city walls, as happens even in our present age. But there was another thing. It was rumored that the Duke had obtained both his title and the city treacherously. Rumor declared that he had systematically destroyed those who had stood in line before him, the members of the princely house that formerly ruled here. He had accomplished the task slyly, hiring assassins talented with poisons and daggers. But rumor also declared that the Duke had not been sufficiently thorough, for though he had meant to rid himself of all that rival house, a single descendant remained, so obscure he had not traced her, for it was a woman. Of course, such matters were not spoken of openly. Like the prophecy of the clock, it was a subject for the dark. Nevertheless, I will tell you at once there was such a descendant he had missed in his bloody work, and she was a woman, Royal and proud she was, and seething with bitter spite and a hunger for vengeance, and as bloody as the Duke, had he known it, in her own way. For her safety in disguise, she had long ago wed a wealthy merchant in the city, and presently bore the man a daughter. The merchant, a dealer in silks, was respected, a good fellow, but not wise. He rejoiced in his handsome and aristocratic wife. He never dreamed what she might be about when he was not with her. In fact, she had sworn allegiance to Satanas. In the dead of night she would go up into an old tower, joining the merchant's house, and there she would say portions of the Black Mass, offer sacrifice, and thereafter practice witchcraft against the Duke. This witchery took a common form, the creation of a wax image, and the maiming of the image that, by sympathy, the injuries inflicted on the wax be passed on to the living body of the victim. The woman was capable in what she did. The Duke fell sick. He lost the use of his limbs, and was racked by excruciating pains, from which he could get no relief. Thinking himself on the brink of death, the Duke named his 16-year-old son his heir. This son was dear to the Duke, as everyone knew, and be sure the woman knew it too. She intended sorcerously to murder the young man in his turn, preferably in his father's sight. Thus she let the Duke linger in his agony, and commenced planning the fate of the prince. Now all this while she had not been toiling alone. She had one helper. It was her own daughter, a maid of 14, that she had recruited to her service nearly as soon as the infant could walk. At 6 or 7, the child had been lisping the satanic rite along with her mother. At 14, you might imagine, the girl was well versed in the black arts, though she did not have her mother's natural genius for them. Perhaps you would like me to describe the daughter at this point. It has a bearing on the story, for the girl was astonishingly beautiful. Her hair was the rich dark red of antique burnished copper. Her eyes were the hue of the reddish golden amber that traders bring from the East. When she walked, you could say she was dancing, but when she danced, a gate seemed to open in the world, and a bright fire spangled inside it. But she was the fire. The girl and the mother were close as gloves in a box. Their games in the old tower bound them closer. No doubt the woman believed herself clever to have got such a helpmate, but it proved her undoing. It was in this manner. The silk merchant, who had never suspected his wife for an instant of anything, began to mistrust the daughter. She was not like other girls. Despite her great beauty, she professed no interest in marriage, and none in clothes or jewels. She preferred to read in the garden at the foot of the tower. Her mother had taught the girl her letters, though the merchant himself could read but poorly, and often the father peered at the books his daughter read, unable to make head or tail of them, yet somehow not liking them. One night very late, the silk merchant came home from a guild dinner in the city, and he saw a slim pale shadow gliding up the steps of the old tower, and he knew it for his child. On impulse he followed her, but quietly. He had not considered any evil so far, and did not want to alarm her. At an angle of the stair, the lighted room above, he paused to spy and listen. He had something of a shock when he heard his wife's voice rise up in glad welcome. But what came next drained the blood from his heart. He crept away and went to his cellar for wine to stay himself. After the third glass, he ran for neighbors and for the watch. The woman and her daughter heard the shouts below, and saw the torches in the garden. It was no use dissembling. The tower was littered with evidence of vile deeds, besides what the woman kept in the chest beneath her unknowing husband's bed. She understood it was all up with her, and she understood, too, how witchcraft was punished hereabouts. She snatched a knife from the altar. The girl shrieked when she realized what her mother was at. The woman caught the girl by her red hair and shook her. "Listen to me, my daughter," she cried, "and listen carefully, for the minutes are short. If you do as I tell you, you can escape their wrath, and only I need die. And if you live, I am satisfied, for you can carry on my labor after me. My vengeance I shall leave you, my witchcraft to exact it by. Indeed, I promise you stronger powers than mine. I will beg my lord Satanas for it, and he will not deny me. For he is just in his fashion, and I have served him well. Now, will you attend?" "I will," said the girl. So the woman advised her and swore her to the fellowship of hell. And then the woman forced the knife into her own heart and dropped dead on the floor of the tower. When the men burst in with their swords and staves, their torches and their madness, the girl was ready for them. She stood blank-faced, blank-eyed, with her arms hanging at her sides. When one touched her, she dropped down at his feet. "Surely she is innocent," this man said. She was lovely enough that it was hard to accuse her. Then her father went to her and took her hand and lifted her. At that the girl opened her eyes, and she said, as if terrified, "How did I come here? I was in my chamber and sleeping." "The woman has bewitched her," the father said. He desired very much that this be so, and when the girl clung to his hand and wept, he was certain of it. They showed her the body with the knife in it. The girl screamed and seemed to lose her senses totally. She was put to bed. In the morning a priest came and questioned her. She answered steadfastly. She remembered nothing, not even of the great books that she had been observed reading. When they told her what was in them, she screamed again, and apparently would have thrown herself from the narrow window, only the priest stopped her. Finally, they brought her to the Holy Cross in order that she might kiss it and prove herself blameless. Then she knelt and whispered softly that nobody should hear but one. "Lord Satanas, protect thy handmaid." And either that gentleman has more power than he is credited with, or else the symbols of God are only as holy as the men who dealt in them, for she embraced the cross, and it left her unscathed. At that, the whole household thanked God, the whole household, saving, of course, the woman's daughter. She had another to thank. The woman's body was burnt, and the ashes put into unconsecrated ground beyond the city gates. Though they had discovered her to be a witch, they had not discovered the direction her witchcraft had selected, nor did they find the wax image with its limbs all twisted and stuck through with needles. The girl had taken that up and concealed it. The Duke continued in his distress, but he did not die. Sometimes, in the dead of night, the girl would unearth the image from under the loose brick by the hearth and gloat over it, but she did nothing else. Not yet. She was 14, and the cloud of her mother's acts still hovered over her. She knew what she must do next. The period of mourning ended. "Daughter," said the silk merchant to her, "why do you not remove your black?" The woman was malign, and led you into wickedness. How long will you mourn her, who deserves no mourning?"
"Oh, my father," said she, "never think I regret my wretched mother. It was my own unwitting sin I mourn."
And she grasped his hand and spilt her tears on it.
"I would rather live in a convent," she said, "than mingle with proper folk. I would seek a convent, too, if it were not that I cannot bear to be parted from you."
Do you suppose that she smiled secretly as she said this? One might suppose it. Presently she donned a robe of sackcloth and poured ashes over her red copper hair.
"It is my penance," she said. "I am glad to atone for my sins."
People forgot her beauty. She was at pains to obscure it. She slunk about like an aged woman, a rag pulled over her head, dirt smeared on her cheeks and brow. She elected to sleep in a cold, cramped attic, and sat all day by a smoky hearth in the kitchens. When someone came to her and begged her to wash her face and put on suitable clothes and sit in the rooms of the house, she smiled modestly, drawing the rag or a piece of hair over her face.
"I swear," she said, "I am glad to be humble before God and men."
They reckoned her pious, and they reckoned her simple. 2 years passed. They mislaid her beauty altogether, and reckoned her ugly. They found it hard to call to mind who she was exactly, as she sat in the ashes or shuffled unattended about the streets like a crone. At the end of the 2nd year, the silk merchant married again. It was inevitable, for he was not a man who liked to live alone. On this occasion, his choice was a harmless widow. She already had 2 daughters, pretty in an unremarkable style. Perhaps the merchant hoped they would comfort him for what had gone before. This normal, cheery wife, with the 2 sweet, rather silly daughters, whose chief interests were clothes and weddings. Perhaps he hoped also that his deranged daughter might be drawn out by company, but that hope foundered. Not that the new mother did not try to be pleasant to the girl, and the new sisters, their hearts grieved by her condition, went to great lengths to enlist her friendship. They begged her to come from the kitchens or the attic. Failing in that, they sometimes ventured to join her, their fine silk dresses trailing on the greasy floor. They combed her hair, exclaiming, when some of the ash and dirt were removed, on its color. But no sooner had they turned away than the girl gathered up handfuls of soot and ash and rubbed them into her hair again. Now and then the sisters attempted to interest their bizarre relative in a bracelet or a gown or a current song. They spoke to her of the young men they had seen at the suppers or the balls, which were then given regularly by the rich families of the city. The girl ignored it all. If she ever said anything, it was to do with penance and humility. At last, as must happen, the sisters wearied of her and left her alone. They had no cares and did not want to share in hers. They came to resent her moping grayness, as indeed the merchant's second wife had already done. "Can you do nothing with the girl?" she demanded of her husband. "People will say that I and my daughters are responsible for her condition, and that I ill-treat the maid for jealousy of her dead mother." "Now how could anyone say that?" protested the merchant, "when you are famous as the epitome of generosity and kindness." Another year passed, and saw no huge difference in the household. A difference there was, but not visible. The girl who slouched in the corner of the hearth was 17. Under the filth and grime she was, impossibly, more beautiful, although no one could see it. And there was one other invisible item, her power, which all this time she had nurtured, saying her prayers to Satanas in the black of midnight. Her power was rising like a dark moon in her soul. 3 days after her 17th birthday, the girls straggled about the streets as she frequently did. A few noted her and muttered it was the merchant's ugly, simple daughter, and paid no more attention. Most did not know her at all. She had made herself appear one with the scores of impoverished flotsam that constantly roamed the city, beggars and starvelings. Just outside the city gates, these persons congregated in large numbers, slumped around fires of burning refuse, or else wandered to and fro in search of edible seeds, scraps, the miracle of a dropped coin. Here the girl now came, and began to wander about as they did. Dusk gathered, and the shadows thickened. The girl sank to her knees in a patch of earth, as if she had found something. 2 or 3 of the beggars sneaked over to see if it was worth snatching from her, but the girl was only scrabbling in empty soil. The beggars, making signs to each other that she was touched by God, mad, left her alone. But very far from mad, the girl presently dug up a stoppered clay urn. In this urn were the ashes and charred bones of her mother. She had got a clue as to the location of the urn by devious questionings here and there. Her occult power had helped her to be sure of it. In the twilight, padding along through the narrow streets and alleys of the city, the girl brought the urn homeward. In the garden at the foot of the old tower, gloom-wrapped, unwitnessed, she unstoppered the urn and buried the ashes freshly. She muttered certain unholy magics over the grave. Then she snapped off the sprig of a young hazel tree and planted it in the newly turned ground. I hazard you have begun to recognize the story by now. I see you suppose I tell it wrongly. Believe me, this is the truth of the matter. But if you would rather I left off the tale, no doubt your carriage will soon be here. No? Very well. I shall continue. I think I should speak of the Duke's son at this juncture. The prince was 19, able, intelligent, and of noble bearing. He was of that rather swarthy type of looks that one finds here in the north, but tall and slim and clear-eyed. There was an ancient square where you might see a statue of him, but much eroded by 2 centuries and the elements. After the city was sacked, no care was lavished on it. The Duke treasured his son. He had constant delight in the sight of the young man and what he said and did. It was the only happiness the invalid had. Then one night the Duke screamed out in his bed. Servants came running with candles. The Duke moaned that a sword was transfixing his heart, an inch at a time. The prince hurried into the chamber, but in that instant the Duke spasmed horribly and died. No mark was on his body. There had never been a mark to show what ailed him. The prince wept. They were genuine tears. He had nothing to reproach his father with, everything to thank him for. Nevertheless, they brought the young man the seal ring of the city, and he put it on. It was winter, a cold blue-white weather, with snow in the street and the countryside, and a hard, wizened sun that drove thin, sharp blades of light through the sky, but gave no warmth. The Duke's funeral cortege passed slowly across the snow, the broad open chariots draped with black and silver, the black-plumed horses, the chanting priests with their glittering robes, their jeweled crucifixes, and golden censers. Crowds lined the roadways to watch the spectacle. Among the beggar women stood a girl. No one noticed her. They did not glimpse the expression she veiled in her ragged scarf. She gazed at the bear pitilessly. As the young prince rode by in his sables, the seal ring on his hand, the eyes of the girl turned through her ashy hair like a red fox through grasses. The duke was buried in the mausoleum you can visit to this day on the east side of the city. Several months elapsed. The prince put his grief from him, took up the business of the city competently. Wise and courteous he was, but he rarely smiled. At 19, his spirit seemed worn. You might think he guessed the destiny that hung over him. The winter was a hard one, too. The snow had come, and having come was loath to withdraw. When at last spring returned, flushing the hills with color, it was no longer sensible to be sad. The prince's name-day fell about this time. A great banquet was planned, a ball. There had been neither in the palace for nigh on 3 years, not since the duke's fatal illness first claimed him. Now the royal doors were to be thrown open to all men of influence and their families. The prince was liberal and charming and clever even in this. Aristocrat and rich trader were to mingle in the beautiful dining room, and in this very chamber, among the frescoes, the marbles, and the candelabra. Even a merchant's daughter, if the merchant were notable in the city, would get to dance on the sea-green floor under the white eye of the fearful clock. The clock. There was some renewed controversy about the clock. They did not dare speak to the young prince. He was a skeptic, as his father had been. But had not a death already occurred? Was the clock not flying in the jaws of fate? For those disturbed by it, there was a dim writing in their minds, in the dust of the street, or the pattern of blossoms. When the clock strikes. But people did not positively heed these warnings. Man is afraid of his fears. He ignores the shadow of the wolf thrown on the pavement before him, saying, "It is only a shadow." The silk merchant received his invitation to the palace, and to be sure thought nothing of the clock. His house had been thrown into uproar. The most luscious silks of his workshop were carried into the house and laid before the wife and her 2 daughters, who chirruped and squealed with excitement. The merchant stood smugly by, above it all, and yet pleased at being appreciated. "Oh, father," cried the 2 sisters, "may I have this one with the gold piping?" "Oh, father, this one with the design of pineapples." Later, a jeweler arrived and set out his trays. The merchant was generous. He wanted his women to look their best. It might be the night of their lives. Yet all the while, at the back of his mind, a little dark spot, itching, aching. He tried to ignore the spot, not to scratch at it. His true daughter, the mad one. Nobody bothered to tell her about the invitation to the palace. They knew how she would react, mumbling in her hair about her sin and her penance, patting her hands in the greasy ash to smear her face. Even the servants avoided her, as if she were just the cat seated by the fire. Less than a cat, for the cat saw to the mice, just a block of stone. And yet, how fair she might have looked, decked in the pick of the merchant's wares, jewels at her throat. The prince himself could not have been unaware of her. Though marriage was impossible, other less holy, though equally honorable contracts might have been arranged to the benefit of all concerned. The merchant sighed. He had scratched the darkness after all. He attempted to comfort himself by watching the 2 sisters exult over their apparel. He refused to admit that the finery would somehow make them seem but more ordinary than they were by contrast. The evening of the banquet arrived. The family set off. Most of the servants sidled after. The prince had distributed largesse in the city. Oxen roasted in the squares, and wine was free by royal order. The house grew somber. In the deserted kitchen, the fire went out. By the hearth, a segment of gloom rose up. The girl glanced around her, and she laughed softly and shook out her filthy hair. Of course, she knew as much as anyone, and more than most. This night was to be her night, too. A few minutes later, she was in the garden beneath the old tower, standing over the young hazel tree which thrust up from the earth. It had become strong, the tree, despite the harsh winter. Now the girl nodded to it. She chanted under her breath. At length a pale light began to grow, far down, near where the roots of the tree held to the ground. Out of the pale glow flew a thin black bird which perched on the girl's shoulder. Together the girl and the bird passed into the old tower. High up a fire blazed that no one had lit. A tub steamed with scented water that no one had drawn. Shapes that were not real and barely seen flitted about. Rare perfumes, the rustle of garments, the glint of gems, as yet invisible, filled and did not fill the restless air. Need I describe further? No. You will have seen paintings which depict the attendance upon a witch of her familiar demons. How one bathes her, another anoints her, another brings clothes and ornaments. Perhaps you do not credit such things in any case. Never mind that. I will tell you what happened in the courtyard before the palace. Many carriages and chariots had driven through the square, avoiding the roasting oxen, the barrels of wine, the cheering drunken citizens, and so through the gates into the courtyard. Just before 10 o'clock, the hour, if you recall, the clock of the magician. A solitary carriage drove through the square and into the court. The people in the square gawped at the carriage and pressed forward to see who would step out of it. This latecomer. It was a remarkable vehicle that looked to be fashioned of solid gold, all but the domed roof that was transparent, flashing crystal. 6 black horses drew it. The coachman and the postilions were clad in crimson and strangely masked as curious beasts and reptiles. One of these beast men now hopped down and opened the door of the carriage. Out came a woman's figure in a cloak of white fur, and glided up the palace stair and in at the doors. There was dancing in the ballroom. The whole chamber was bright and clamorous with music and the voices of men and women. There, between those 2 pillars, the prince sat, in his chair, dark, courteous, seldom smiling. Here the musicians played, the deep-throated viol, the lively mandolin, and there the dancers moved up and down on the sea-green floor. But the music and the dancers had just paused, the figures on the clock themselves in motion. The hour of the magician was about to strike. As it struck, through the doorway came the figure in the fur cloak, and, as if they must, every eye turned to her. For an instant she stood there, all white, as though she had brought the winter snow back with her, and then she loosed the cloak from her shoulders. It slipped away, and she was all fire. She wore a gown of apricot brocade embroidered thickly with gold. Her sleeves and the bodice of her gown were slashed over ivory satin sewn with large rosy pearls. Pearls, too, were bound in her hair, that was the shade of antique burnished copper. She was so beautiful that when the clock was still, nobody spoke. She was so beautiful that it was hard to look at her for very long. The prince got up from his chair. He did not know that he had. Now he started out across the floor between the dancers, who parted silently to let him through. He went toward the girl in the doorway as if she drew him by a chain. The prince had hardly ever acted without considering first what he did. Now he did not consider. He bowed to the girl. "Madame," he said. "You are welcome, madame," he said. "Tell me who you are." She smiled. "My rank," she said. "Would you know that, my lord? It is similar to yours, or would be, were I now mistress of my dead mother's palace. But, unfortunately, an unscrupulous man caused the downfall of our house." "Unfortunate indeed," said the prince. "Tell me your name. Let me right the wrong done you." "You shall," said the girl. "Trust me, you shall. But my name, I would rather keep it secret for present. But you may call me, if you will, a pet name I have given myself. Ashella." "Ashella. But I see no ash about you," said the prince, dazzled by her gleam, laughing a little stiffly, for laughter was not his habit. "Ash and cinders from a cold and bitter hearth," said she. But she smiled again. "Now everyone is staring at us, my lord, and the musicians are impatient to begin again. Out of all these ladies, can it be you will lead me in a dance?" "As long as you will dance," he said, "you shall dance with me." And that was how it was. There were many dances, slow and fast, whirling measures and gentle ones, and here and there the prince and the maiden were parted. Always, then, he looked eagerly after her, sparing no regard for other girls whose hands lay in his. It was not like him. He was usually so careful, but the other young men who danced on that floor, who clasped her fingers or her narrow waist in the dance, also gazed after her when she was gone. She danced, as she appeared, like fire. Though if you had asked those young men whether they would rather tie her to themselves, as the prince did, they would have been at a loss, for it was not easy to keep pace with fire. The hour of the hag struck on the clock. The prince drew weary of dancing with the girl and losing her in the dance to others, and re-finding her and losing her again. Behind the curtains there is a tall window in the east wall that opens on the terrace above the garden. He drew her out there into the spring night. He gave an order, and small tables were brought, with delicacies and sweets and wine. He sat by her, watching every gesture she made, as if he would paint her portrait afterward. In the ballroom here, under the clock, people murmured, but it was not quite the murmur you would expect, the scandalous murmur about a woman come from nowhere that the prince had made so much of. At the periphery of the ballroom, the silk merchant sat, pale as a ghost, thinking of a ghost, the living ghost of his true daughter. No one else recognized her, only he. Some trick of the heart had enabled him to know her. He said nothing of it. As the stepsisters and wife gossiped with other wives and sisters, an awful foreboding weighed him down, sent him cold and dumb. And now it was almost midnight, the moment when the page of the night turns over into day. Almost midnight, the hour when the figure of death strikes the golden bell of the clock. And what will happen when the clock strikes? Your face announces that you know. Be patient. Let us see if you do. "I am being foolish," said the prince to Ashella on the terrace, "but perhaps I am entitled to be foolish just once in my life." What are you saying?" For the girl was speaking low beside him, and he could not catch her words. "I am saying a spell to bind you to me," she said. "But I am already bound." "Be bound, then. Never go free." "I do not wish it," he said. He kissed her hands, and he said, "I do not know you, but I will wed you." "Is that proof your spell has worked?" "I will wed you, and get back for you the rights you have lost." "If it were only so simple," said Ashella, smiling. "But that is too cruel. Justice requires a harsher payment." And then, in the ballroom, Death struck the first note on the golden bell. The girl smiled, and she said, "I curse you in my mother's name." The second stroke, "I curse you in my own name." The third stroke, "And in the name of those your father slew." The fourth stroke, "And in the name of my master who rules the world." As the fifth, the sixth, the seventh strokes pealed out, the prince stood nonplussed. At the eighth and ninth strokes, the strength of the malediction seemed to curdle his blood. He shivered, and his brain writhed. At the 10th stroke, he saw a change in the loveliness before him. She drew thinner, taller. At the 11th stroke, he beheld a thing in a ragged black cowl and robe. It grinned at him. It was all grin below a triangle of sockets of nose and eyes. At the 12th stroke, the prince saw Death and knew him. In the ballroom, a hideous grinding noise as the gears of the clock failed, followed by a hollow booming as the mechanism stopped entirely. The conjuration of Death vanished from the terrace. Only one thing was left behind, a woman's shoe, a shoe no woman could ever have danced in. It was made of glass. Did you intend to protest about the shoe? Shall I finish the story, or would you rather I did not? It is not the ending you are familiar with. Yes, I perceive you understand that now. I will go quickly, then, for your carriage must soon be here, and there is not a great deal more to relate. The prince lost his mind, partly from what he had seen, partly from the spells the young witch had netted him in. He could think of nothing but the girl who had named herself Ashella. He raved that Death had borne her away, but that he would recover her from death. She had left the glass shoe as a token of her love. He must discover her with the aid of the shoe. Whomsoever the shoe fitted would be Ashella, for there was this added complication, that Death might hide her actual appearance. None had seen the girl before. She had disappeared like smoke. The one infallible test was the shoe. That was why she had left it for him. His ministers would have reasoned with the prince, but he was past reason. His intellect had collapsed as totally as only a profound intellect can. A lunatic, he rode about the city. He struck out at those who argued with him. On a particular occasion, drawing a dagger, he killed, not apparently noticing what he did. His demand was explicit. Every woman, young or old, maid or married, must come forth from her home, must put her foot into a shoe of glass. They came. They had no choice. Some approached in terror, some weeping. Even an aged beggar woman obliged, and they cackled, enjoying the sight of royalty gone mad. One alone did not come. Now, it is not illogical that out of the hundreds of women whose feet were put into the shoe, a single woman might be found that the shoe fitted. But this did not happen, nor did the situation alter, despite a lurid fable that some, tickled by the idea of wedding the prince, cut off their toes that the shoe might fit them. And if they did, it was to no avail, for the shoe did not. Is it really surprising? The shoe was sorcerous. It constantly changed itself in shape, its size, in order that no foot, save one, could ever be got into it. Summer spread across the land. The city took on its golden summer glaze, its fetid summer smell. What had been a whisper of intrigue swelled into a steady distant thunder. Plots were being hatched. One day the silk merchant was brought, trembling and gray of face, to the prince. The merchant's dumbness had broken. He had unburdened himself of his fear at confession, but the priest had not proved honest. In the dawn, men had knocked on the door of the merchant's house. Now he stumbled to the chair of the prince. Both looked twice their years, but, if anything, the prince looked the elder. He did not lift his eyes. Over and over in his hands he turned the glass shoe. The merchant, stumbling too in his speech, told the tale of his first wife and his daughter. He told everything, leaving out no detail. He did not even omit the end, that since the night of the banquet the girl had been absent from his house, taking nothing with her save a young hazel from the garden beneath the tower. The prince leapt from his chair. His clothes were filthy and unkempt. His face was smeared with sweat and dust. It resembled, momentarily, another face. Without guard or attendant, the prince ran through the city toward the merchant's house, and on the road the intriguers waylaid and slew him. As he fell, the glass shoe dropped from his hand and shattered in 1,000 fragments. There is little else worth mentioning. Those who usurped the city were villains, and not merely that, but fools. Within a year, external enemies were at the gates. A year more, the city had been sacked, half burnt out, ruined. The manner in which you find it now is somewhat better than it was then, but it has not now anything for a man to be proud of. As you were quick to note, many here earn a miserable existence by conducting visitors about the streets, the palace, showing them the dregs of the city's past. Which was not a request, in fact, for you to give me money. Throw some from your carriage window if your conscience bothers you. My own wants are few. No, I have no further news of the girl, Ashella, the witch, a devotee of Satanus. She was doubtless worked plentiful woe in the world, and a witch is long-lived. Even so, she will die eventually. None escapes death. Then you may pity her if you like. Those who serve the gentlemen below, who can guess their final lot will be. I am very sorry the story did not please you. It is not, maybe, a happy choice before a journey. And there is your carriage at last. What? Ah, no. I shall stay here in the ballroom where you came on me. I have often paused here through the years. It is the clock. It has a certain, what shall I call it, power to draw me back. I am not trying to unnerve you. Why should you suppose that? Because of my knowledge of the city, of the story? You think that I am implying that I myself am death? Now you laugh. Yes, it is absurd. Observe the 12th figure on the clock. Is he not, as you have always heard, death described? And am I in the least like that 12th figure? Although, of course, the story was not as you have heard it either.